Welcome to Lean Into Leadership, where we lead the conversation about anything and everything leadership related. On today's episode, Dr. Drevon joins the show. Hey everybody, it's Brandon Skiles, and welcome to the next episode, episode 2 of Lean Into Leadership. Super excited for this one. We're going to have a great conversation, great topics today. Today we're going to learn about a little bit of leadership in the classroom, outside of the classroom experiences, and how to create them yourself as a leader. But before we jump into that, a quick little bio of our special guest, Dr. Jennifer Drevon. Two big things have kind of happened recently in your career over the last year or so. First one, recently named the Associate Director of the Leadership Institute here at CMU, which is awesome, very well deserved. And another one is, I think your education career might be kind of finished now, unless you want to do more education, but PhD in educational leadership. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, well, welcome. How are you doing today? Glad you're here.
I'm doing great. How are you?
Doing great. We're glad you're here.
Thanks.
But before we jump into content, I'd love for you to have the chance to kind of talk with our audience a little bit and share a little bit more about who you are, what you do, the work you do, and why you do it.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. Like Brandon mentioned, my name is Jennifer Drevon. The pronouns that I use are she, her, and hers, and I'm excited to be here because I get excited to talk about leadership and kind of lean into this conversation about academics and co-curricular, these out-of-classroom experiences. Like Brandon mentioned, growth and learning is one of my core values, so I recently wrapped up my PhD in educational leadership where I really focused on those relationships between students and these out-of-classroom experiences, how support systems all factor into that. So it's an exciting time to be here and talk about those things. I like to read, just like you all. I was just a student, so I'm reading for fun now instead of reading textbooks. I like to spend time with my family, get outside, and mostly spend time with students and our Leadership Institute team. But thanks for having me.
Yeah, so what are you reading right now? Do you mind sharing?
Yeah, it's actually a common read for our Leadership Institute team, and it's called Radical Candor, which is an interesting book that talks about how to have great conversations and get to know your team for who they are as a whole person, which is something I'm super passionate about because we're all more than one thing. So it's been nice to be able to see how to do that well within a team as a supervisor, supervisee, or just a human.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, of course.
Just some bonus knowledge, right? Pick up that book. Definitely give it a read. We haven't finished it quite yet, but it's been pretty good so far. So, yeah. If you're looking for some extra outside of the classroom learning, Radical Candor. So, diving in kind of now to the content today, that first question. So, obviously, learning how to lead is so important, right? So, we make sure we're doing that efficiently, ethically, and things like that. But why is it so important to also have that leadership learning component and conversation in the classroom or in academics?
Yeah, I think leadership gets conveyed in a bunch of different ways depending on how you see that. Like, we grow up with leaders all around us, whether it's leaders in the household, leaders at school, leaders in a church setting, or political leaders, right? And so how we form our thoughts around leadership typically come from these outside influences, right? But I think that also stifles folks' ability to see themselves as leaders, because if I'm not like this person, or if I'm not leading in that way, am I really a leader? And and this podcast hopefully reinforces that leadership is for everyone. And so what I think the opportunity is you get to come to college and you get to have a more formal setting to dive into leadership learning. I know I struggled to identify myself as a leader, but being able to get into a classroom and have these conversations around different leadership styles gives a shared language to what leadership means. And it also lets you take a second and think about what your own strengths are as a leader and what your own areas of growth are. And without understanding what those things are and having a formal way to kind of understand those things, you can't necessarily always grow and learn in all the ways you could if you didn't have that in-class experience.
Love that. Was there a defining moment, or maybe a few, so far on your journey where you kind of realized hey, I'm a leader, right? This is maybe the first time it really connected for you. Maybe some of those things you kind of saw, maybe it connected the dots, but then it really kind of had maybe an experience, or maybe it was some type of a leadership coursework you went through, anything like that sparks that moment for you? Yeah,
so in high school, I had more formal leadership experiences.
Okay.
I was editor of the school newspaper, which was a great experience. But when I got to college, I was surrounded by students who we're all doing that.
Yeah.
Everyone came to college with a different type of experience and leading in their own way. And then I came here, I got involved in alternative breaks, which is a great program. And that helped me define what my leadership meant in relation to service and serving others, which I think was wonderful. But it wasn't until I actually started diving into my work in the Leadership Institute that I was able to gain the knowledge and the language to see that the areas that I originally thought were more areas of growth or weakness were actually strengths for how I lead. And so having that language and understanding how being adaptive and like paying attention to the details, and I didn't always have to be the loudest person in the room in order to lead, really helped me understand and formalize myself as a leader.
I love how you kind of mentioned that, how it's almost like sometimes the way we see leadership maybe in society or how we see it before we dive into that is by a certain type or certain personality traits, right? And you almost think, or maybe even tell yourself, if I don't hold these, I'm not a leader, which is totally, completely far from the truth right there. Which is really cool that someone who's, gets to teach leadership to so many people also went through that journey and shared. I mean, I had kind of a similar journey myself, right? So that's super awesome. So high school to college. So did you feel like it was kind of late in the game? Did you feel like it was like on timing? Because I know sometimes we think like it's too late to maybe take that leadership role or that kind of challenge, or did you feel like kind of confident and feeling good about that?
I think at the time I felt like I was doing leadership well.
Love that.
And I don't think I wasn't doing it well.
Yeah.
I think the big thing is that as you continue to grow and learn, your leadership evolves over time. And so I had the opportunity to work for Big Brothers Big Sisters for a number of years prior to coming back to Central Michigan University, and what my leadership looked like there really strengthened my ability to talk to others. I was working with kiddos and volunteers and being able to have conversations in a different way than I did in college. And when I came to CMU and learned about leadership in another way from Dan and from, my peers in the Leadership Institute and here at CMU, I learned even more ways. So I think it's all about learning and growth. I don't know if I would have been in the same headspace if I would have tried to take these academic classes when I was younger. I really wish I would have had that knowledge and language and taken advantage of that. But I don't know if I was ready. It all seems to kind of fall into place when you need it to.
Yeah, love that. So you have the opportunity to teach one of the core leadership classes here at CMU, LDR 200, specifically the L section for LAS scholars. But that class is also offered in a different format to all students who might be thinking about adding a leadership component to their education, or maybe they just want to take a class, which I highly recommend you take that course. It's really a solid introductory class to leadership. But can you tell us a little bit about maybe some of the concepts that students might learn in that coursework, or maybe coursework similar to that in your experience?
Yeah, for sure. So LDR 200 really focuses on more formal leadership theory. So if you think about, we have these things called the cross-campus leadership initiatives here on campus where we define leadership and what leadership learning looks like for students. And this class really focuses on that. So we really focus on those core original leadership philosophies. So this idea is, are you born a leader, or is that something you can learn and grow in? And so we really reinforce the ideas of anyone can be a leader, you can learn and grow in that space. So we teach actual theories like adaptive leadership, servant leadership. We talk about what that means. And we have to continue to evolve, because just like I evolved as a leader, leadership theory evolves. A lot of these were started in a time where white male privilege was predominant. And so a lot of these theories are found by folks that represent that identity or were assessed by that identity. And I think we're learning that leadership looks different. So we're looking more at inclusive leadership, or how do we push past those stereotypical narratives around what leadership looks like, and kind of have those conversations. So even as we look back in history and talk about things like adaptive leadership and these theories that are so important, we're also putting a current spin on it. What does that look like for all college students? What does that look like for me? And how do I push back on some of those things that have been the norm for leadership for so long?
That's really interesting. It is really, really a cool and unique class, and just a great way to kind of dive deeper into some of that leadership theory, because it is different, in the classroom versus some of those experiences outside of the classroom, which we'll get to in a little bit. So in your experience kind of teaching some leadership coursework, working with students that have gone through those kind of classes, how can students be successful in those classes to really kind of get those key takeaways and really kind of pull out some development from those courses? Because they are a little bit structured, I think, at least in my experience, a little bit differently than some other coursework you might take as a college student.
Yeah, I think with all courses, what you put into it is what you're going to get out. When you're talking about leadership, these courses are asking you to do a lot of personal reflection, and that requires a bit of vulnerability, which is safe for some folks and not necessarily safe for others in a classroom setting. But really asking yourself, like, am I being true to who I am when I look at this leadership theory and say, like, yes, this is my strength. I'm an adaptive leader. Or am I saying that because that's what I think I should say?
Yeah.
So making sure that you're being really reflective in that process, understanding that every leadership approach has some strengths and areas for improvement, and no one person is one thing. So I think these classes have the ability to people like, I'm an adaptive leader. Well, yeah, you're an adaptive leader, right? That might be your comfort zone, but you're so much more than that. You could be that and a servant leader. You could be that and a different approach. It's really just based on what goals you have as a group or the group you're leading and what kind of fits with what you need in that time of your life.
Yeah. I love that. Can we dive deeper a little bit into that, right? Because you kind of mentioned it there. Sometimes we really kind of get caught up and almost box ourselves into a style, right? With assessments, some of those leadership quizzes, and that's in other areas too. But a lot of those are geared to tell you this is maybe my dominant style. But what sometimes we don't remember or take a look at is the perspective of this is, maybe in one setting or the one type of mindset we took it in that moment, and how your leadership can look differently in different environments.
But the thing is, we all still have other places or other avenues that we have the ability to shine in, right?
Yeah.
So yes, this might be our comfort zone, but if I have a dominant personality style or a dominant approach, that's not going to work in every case. So if you look at each one of those, you're not all one thing and nothing of another. So if you've ever filled out one of those things, you might have numbers at the bottom. None of them are a 0.
Yeah.
Like, you have some of those qualities. Sometimes I'm calm and sometimes I have energy, right? Just because my go-to is to be more calm doesn't mean I don't have the ability to turn it on when I need to. I won't always be at a 10. I can't show up in a space and be Dr. Jonathan Glenn or Dan Gakin. That's not true to who I am.
Right.
But when I need to, I can build myself up. I can practice those skills and show up in a space and kind of still be authentic to who I am, even when it's not my dominant style. So just making sure that you understand that these are all approaches and we can ebb and flow, and whatever's important to you one day could change in what you need to do the next.
It's an awesome response. So critical too, because again, right, it really depends on the different environment or the different team or the people you're working with when you're in those leadership roles. And sometimes even too, you got to take on more of that follower role, right? When there's other people around you too. So being kind of adaptive, which we talked a little bit earlier, that style of leadership within your own leadership and experience is so critical too. And even the approaches you take. Yeah, I love that. So talking about little in the classroom experiences, what has been one of your favorite kind of assignments, we'll say, or projects that you've been able to kind of infuse in leadership learning?
I love when students reflect on what their own leadership approach is. So if you look at, there's like leader-member exchange, there's a laundry list of them. And I think they have the ability to sit there, reflect on what they think they know, and they're like, oh, this is me, this is true to who I am. And I feel like it really opens up language, because they're like, if I'm really good at this and this style or this approach says I'm also good at this, maybe I am. So it builds not only the shared language, but it gives them the ability to feel more confident in how they approach their leadership abilities. I also love when they facilitate with their peers on what the leadership styles are, because we all read the same things, right? You might read the same chapter as me, but what my key takeaways, or I like to call them my key nuggets to take with me, might be completely different from what yours are. So when I have a group of students get up and talk to me about a leadership theory, they always hit on the same key points, but it's those nuances that I realize are more important to certain folks than they are to others. And it's really wonderful to see how we can all read the same words but approach leadership in a different way.
I love that. You can kind of share and learn at the same time, right? Grow together, right?
And they're so creative. They come up with songs and dances and game shows, and that's always fun to see.
Love that.
Leadership learning can be fun.
Oh, for sure. It is a blast. Kind of the revolving thing right there, and I'm sure we'll even hit upon it a little bit later too, and we talked a lot about it in the last episode, is really self-awareness, right? And kind of finding who you are as a leader is such a big piece to your leadership development. And also bringing your authentic version of who you are to the space or that environment with a team. So it's just really, I just wanted to kind of note that, because it's what we did talk about that a lot last episode. We'll probably dive deeper into it this episode, but the viewers, when you kind of see that, maybe take note of those repetitive things, because I think those are transferable across different things, whether again that's self-care and healthy boundaries. You really have to know who you are to put those into place, but the same as is when you're finding your own leadership style and what works best for you in different environments. So kind of segueing now from in the classroom experiences to outside of the classroom experience, because we really do know that a lot of that learning, development, key takeaways experience comes from those outside of the classroom experiences, with that learning component, added to it, which we call co-curricular programs in higher ed. But we'll keep it simple with just those learning experience outside of the classroom. What's been the hardest thing, I think, from facilitating in the classroom in your experience to outside of the classroom experiences, because they are so different at different times?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Inside the classroom, as an instructor, as a professor, as someone co-constructing knowledge with students in a classroom, you have a little bit more control over the space. You have the ability to assess what they're learning and how they're applying it, right? But when you go outside of the classroom, that's on them.
Yeah.
They're the ones doing those experiences. So I think it's just understanding that everything that they're learning in the classroom, they may understand or grasp onto some concepts and maybe not to others, right? But they won't know until they try them out themselves. Gotcha. So getting involved outside of the classroom is where you can say, yes, leader-member exchange is important to me, adaptive leadership, servant leadership, but that's great. You can say it as much as you want, but what happens when you're in front of your registered student organization or your Greek organization? Are you practicing what you've reflected on? Are you doing the things you say you do? And if anyone's brutally honest, it will be your peers and tell you whether or not you're doing those things. So you can have that language. You can say what your strengths and areas of growth are in the classroom, but until you're doing that and can reflect and actually apply those concepts, you're only getting half the puzzle.
For sure. Love that.
Yeah.
So how can students find those outside of the classroom learning experiences through leadership and kind of, sometimes get into those more leadership roles, I guess?
Yeah, I think that there is the ability to grow and learn in any position, right? I never think you're too old or too far along. Like, I'm a junior, I shouldn't become a member of this organization I've never heard of. No, I think the ability to get into what you're passionate about, you might not define your why or what you're passionate about to your third or fourth year.
Right.
And so I think you pivot, you find what you're passionate about. And when you're passionate about something, it's far easier to become a leader in that space because you want to be there. You want to show up. You want to see it be successful. So never being afraid to pivot. I think it's, even if you don't think you might like it, try it. I think trying different things helps you find your purpose and passion for what that might look like. But at the end of the day, there are a bunch of people here that at CMU that want you to be successful. Talk to your family, talk to people in the Leadership Institute, but mostly talk to your friends, right? These are the people you know and trust, and they're going to be able to steer you in the right direction. But if you don't know where to start, we have the Office of Student Activities and Involvement. They have the great ability to connect you with things you're involved in, like peer involvement advisors. You just got to try. Yeah. And once you find your thing, I always like to say we've done a ton of research. We've talked about this. Right. My passion project around what employers are looking for in leadership. And something at the end of the day, if you want to be an ethical leader and you want to practice those things, you have to start out with breadth. Try a bunch of different things and see what sticks. But over time, become more committed and really dive into that idea of breadth versus depth. So by the end of your college career, maybe you're really involved in one or two things where you're taking more leadership roles. And leadership doesn't have to be the president or vice president. Right. You don't have to be in a formal leadership position. You can plan a fundraiser. You can get involved and set up podcasts for people in offices. You can do a bunch of different things that are leadership roles. Yeah.
I love that. I want to touch upon that because that's where I was actually going to go with that. I'm glad you brought up near the end. Is oftentimes I think we hear like, oh, I'm not in this leadership role or this title, right? And we always have that discussion about you can lead without a title. But how can maybe someone listening to this right now who maybe doesn't have a lot of experience taking on leadership roles, maybe a little bit nervous, maybe has a little bit of confidence, lack of confidence in that because it can be challenging. How can they go about making a difference and taking on leadership roles without maybe having that title?
Yeah, I think there's two ways. Yeah. One, find the people that have the positions that you think you would do well in. Okay. Get to know them. Find out what ways they've modeled leadership. So if you're looking up to Brandon as a leader on this campus, spend time asking questions like, talk to me about your leadership approach, or how did you get to where you are now? Asking those kind of questions are a great way to see what you need to do in order to kind of build up that confidence. Asking your friends and family. is another great way to talk about, like, where do you see me shine the most,
Yeah.
and how can I continue to build those skills? Also, attend leadership programming. Nothing builds you up like coming to Leadership Institute programs or programs across this campus, not necessarily even just the Leadership Institute, where you can learn about your own style, your own approach, and how to get involved. And then lastly, I think a lot of folks don't know how to articulate their leadership if it isn't in a formal position.
Right.
But if I go into a job interview, if I go into, I'm interviewing for a job with Dan, and I go in and I'm like, but I was the assistant director of the Leadership Institute. He's like, that's great, but what does that mean, right? But if I say, you know, I helped lead scholars through this protocol, or I helped identify leadership learning opportunities on campus, that's leadership without me ever having to say a title.
Right.
So I think it's all in how you frame it, how you express it, and how you show up.
Yeah. Love that.
Yeah.
A great response. Some really great advice and tips that you can use. And definitely, I mean, we'll talk a little bit later on this show, maybe not this episode, but about mentorship and why that's so important. But seriously, you know, find someone that you look up to or someone that can help you along the way. It's going to make it so much easier, your journey. You're going to learn so much more and make valuable connections along the way as well. So kind of still going into the outside of the classroom experience, kind of like inside the classroom, we touched upon it a little bit earlier. Is there anything else that students can do to really make the most out of their co-curricular learning experiences besides just kind of the cliches, like what you make of it, you know, is what you're going to get out of it? Is there anything else, maybe like steps that they can take to really ensure that? Like maybe they go to an event or they're in this program and they lead something. What can they do outside to continue that learning or even maybe further develop what they just thought about?
Yeah, one of the most important things we can do as leaders is constantly learn, grow, and reflect.
Yeah.
So after an experience or a leadership role that you're in, ask yourself, what did I do well? Ask those around you what you did well,
Sure.
what areas you could improve in. Seek additional information. There are wonderful podcasts. There are wonderful resources. There's email lists. There are books. There are things that you can look into that kind of fit your own style. Again, you're not going to get everything from one book because that's written by one person.
Mm-hmm.
And our perspective and our lived experiences are so different. So making sure that you find a vast array, follow people that are completely different than you on social media and see what their leadership's like. Find the most ethical leader you know and see what they're up to and how they're kind of showing up in the world. I think that gives you the ability to do that. And then always asking yourself, how can I get better? What can I do? And then coming back to your why, which I know we talk about and I'm assuming will pop up in the podcast a couple times, is at the end of the day, is this what my purpose is? Is this what my passion is? And this is why I'm excited to be a leader.
I love that. There's so much that I think the audience can definitely do outside of, again, those specific learning experiences, like that reflective work. What was 3 words you said there? I love that. Learn, reflect, and grow.
Grow. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
That was awesome. But seriously, like, again, there's so much opportunity. You just kind of have to push yourself, right, to kind of find those things and talk to the people that will help you get there, which there's a bunch here, at least at Central. And if you're listening elsewhere, I'm sure there's some great support systems around as well to find. So what can a student here at Central, and maybe also we can maybe generalize it a little bit more, what can they typically expect out of kind of maybe an entry-level leadership program?
Yeah, well, I can speak to my lived experiences. So I've had some leadership experiences, or I've worked in the volunteer center here on campus.
Okay.
I've also worked in the Leadership Institute, had close partnerships with the Career Development Center. I've had partnerships with student activities and involvement. And each area does things a little different. For alternative breaks, for example, just go on an alternative break. That's your first step, right? Is to understand what you're signing up for and understanding if this aligns with your values, you know? So go on an alternative break. Sometimes if you see a sign that says free ice cream, just show up. Like if you want ice cream and it's a leadership program and you don't know what you're walking into, just get the ice cream, meet a couple people, and kind of see what that is, especially if it's a short time commitment.
Yeah.
Those are the best ways to kind of feel out, is this the space for me? Do my own philosophies around leadership kind of align with what they're sharing? And I think most of the time you're learning leadership outside of the classroom and these out of classroom experiences without even knowing it when you go to become a member of a registered student organization. If you sign up to volunteer, if you're getting involved in helping plan like Impact or Leadership Safari on campus, those different things are an entryway into learning and being mentored by a ton of folks on this campus that will help you achieve not only your goals, but make you a better leader along the way.
Love that. So touching upon all these involvements and how to kind of go about finding leadership roles, is there any advice for viewers watching when you kind of are in that leadership role and then you're not maybe in the same organization, maybe it's for a program, or maybe it's from a different program, but you're still heavily involved and you lead, and maybe it's the same peers, right? Maybe you're kind of that go-to person or you in that organization or that program, and then you go somewhere else and it's someone else. How can you navigate that? So you're kind of, I'm not a word it, but you're kind of respecting that other person's leadership development and opportunity, but yet still bring your value and your knowledge to the team as well, almost more as like that follower, as a team member instead. Because I know that could be a really tough dynamic to kind of juggle, especially when you're so used to maybe having some of those bigger responsibilities assigned to you naturally in one place or the other.
Yeah, I think leadership and ego can kind of get wrapped up in each other sometimes, and that can be challenging. But I think when you reframe taking a step back as you are now mentoring the next generation of leaders, because that's the goal, right? Our whole hope is that things continue to get better for the future, for future generations, for future generations of your registered student organization. I think you have to have trust that what you've done is good enough, and that you need to be able to set the next person up for success. And if you've done what you can and you're willing to mentor them just as you've been mentored before, we all know what it's like to be a member in an org. You're like, when I'm in this position, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
And we have to, as leaders, if we leave that space, understand that what was great at the time might not be the best anymore.
Yeah.
But you do what you can with what you can at the time. So what's your sphere of influence at that time? When you're a leader, you may have the ability to make more decisions or have more positionality to make those calls. But if you're doing it right and you're ethically leading, it's just as important to be a follower, and you just want to see people lead and be successful in the same ways you were.
Love that.
Yeah.
Building people up, right, along the way.
It's
so
the trust factor.
Yeah,
it's so hard,
it
especially
is,
if you can't delegate. It's a learned skill for sure.
Yeah, love that. So, again, so quickly as we've learned so far throughout this episode is development, experiences, best way to do it is just to do it, right? Take the jump and just join an RSO, which is a registered student organization, anything out there, a program, development, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to kind of go into now, like, how can a student, you kind of learn, I guess we've learned so far about, like, what the academic side and outside of the classroom experience. So, like, now we're going to jump into maybe how someone can kind of create these experiences as a leader for others. So kind of going into that, do you have any just advice that comes off the top of the head that students or listeners that would benefit from that could take away when creating some new experiences for others in their organization?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, when you have a good idea, run with it.
Yeah.
Like, we as either students, I was just a student myself, so I refer to myself in this group sometimes. We as students see the gaps in what we're learning. We see the gaps on campus. We see the things that we're like I said, if I were to do this is how I would do it. And find yourself a mentor.
Yeah.
Ask good questions. I know anyone in the Leadership Institute team, I know many of the folks in the Division of Student Affairs that work with students day in and day out are more than happy to talk with you about what that means, whether that's starting a new organization on campus, whether that's steering a current organization in another direction, or if you're like, hey, we don't have a program on facilitation, and I see that's a gap that we have here. Just say, like, can I help you?
Yeah.
Can I do this with you? You won't know until you ask, so just start putting it out in the universe. Dr. John Glenn, you just got to manifest that stuff.
Yeah.
So there are enough people here to help you. So just say what you want and go for it.
Say what you want. I like that. Another thing that you kind of mention a lot, and I think this is so important, especially when creating experiences, especially new experiences, and almost, again, taking kind of that jump or that making that push, is the idea of launching at 60%. You want to dive deeper into that for me real quick?
Yeah, I can't even remember. Was it Essentialism? I can't remember what book. I went to the Institute of the Curricular Approach, which was a conference that kind of talked about developing learning outcomes and tying all these things. There's a fancy way of telling us to be intentional about what we do, right? And they had this philosophy of launch at 60%. I don't know about y'all, but I know a ton of leaders who are like, if it isn't perfect, I'm not doing it.
Right.
But the problem is nothing's ever perfect, right? And so when you launch at 60%, and obviously there's some risk here. Like, if this is going out to the public, or if this is something that puts yourself or something you're passionate about at risk, maybe maybe launch at 80%, right? But nothing's going to be perfect. When you launch at 60%, you have the ability to continue to adapt and grow, because no matter what you do, the more perspectives. Like you could launch this podcast, and someone has feedback like, hey, why didn't you ask this question? Or it would have really been helpful if you would have framed it more this way. You wouldn't have known that, but you at least put something out there, and now maybe you're closer to 70, 80, 100%. So it takes a little time to do that. And I don't know about y'all, but I will sit on something forever if it doesn't feel perfect. And then I realize most of the time 60% is enough, because most people don't know what your vision is. And if you didn't quite hit it, they're still going to be really impressed with what you put out there.
100%. Well, real quick on that, the comments section is available if you want to leave some feedback, or if we didn't ask the right questions, we'd love to hear those. But no, seriously, I think it's in the mindset, like, again, we have to have that perfectionism outlook, right? It has to be 100% or close to it to hit. I think that's kind of almost honestly why we kind of dragged our feet a little bit on this podcast. It was in my mind for a long time, and I kept making those excuses in my mind, like, I don't know, I don't know this, or I don't have this skill, or I don't, we're going to make it better. Hopefully episode 10 is going to go way better than episode 2. We'll have you back for episode 10. That's why. But, just as we improve and kind of figure things out as well as we go along the way, it's so important. And I think you really have to it's hard to do 100% have empathy for that, because, again, especially when you're putting something creative out, right, into the world. But at the same time, though, it's like the mindset of, would you rather not do it at all and see what could have happened, or take that launch at 60%, learn as you go? And again, too, as we talked about, even with leadership development opportunities and stuff, you're going to learn as you do it, right? You're going to make mistakes along the way, and that's totally okay. But when you're doing that learning, growing, and reflective work, I love that. We're gonna use that tagline more. That's when you really start to develop and things start to come together, right? It's not going to be perfect the first time you do something, obviously, right? And when is anything really perfect anyways, right? So
correct. We're all starting with a crappy first draft, right?
Exactly.
You can't edit nothing.
100%. So, no, I love that. Just, again, launching at 60%. Push yourself. Again, too, put your best effort forward, definitely. We're not saying, don't try, but it's more of, it's okay if you don't have all the questions answered or the perfect formula to do something, because, again, it might not be one. You might discover something while you launch at 60% that makes things so much better. So that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, of course.
So kind of, again, diving into some students having the opportunity to kind of bring leadership development into their teams or organizations. Are there any key things that they should focus on? Are there some, let's reframe that. Are there maybe beginning things to focus on for maybe some more beginner leadership development, and are there more intermediate things that students can kind of bring in, I guess, knowledge and opportunities for their fellow peers?
Yeah, I think a lot of leaders on this campus are already doing those things, right? I think we just don't necessarily always call it leadership development, because when you have community builders in an organization, when you take your group to, Island Park and have a field day, you're building community. And all leadership is a relationship between a person, and I don't even like to say followers, because it's a group of shared people with a shared vision, right, that you're helping lead along that way. So as soon as you're doing those things, getting to know them as humans, building that trust, outlining what your vision is and what your goals are, you're already doing all of that basic leadership development. You might just not call it that. But if you're wanting to elevate, if you're wanting to not only do that personally, but for your group, you have to be able to leverage the resources available to you. Whether that's coming to the Leadership Institute and asking, hey, can you do a program for us? I know we'd be happy to do so. Checking in with what other resources are available to you. Find a conference that maybe ties your leadership development with your area of interest. I know there's some student budget allocation committee or ASPAC funds that are available to students that are part of registered student organizations that can kind of help you do those things. So just ask the professionals on this campus. We love to support students, and we know resources that maybe you're not aware of. So just ask, and we'd be happy to help you take the next step.
I love that. It's important.
Yeah.
Let's talking about asking for resources. What about collaboration, right? As that's a huge thing, I think, that we're starting to realize, not just in higher ed, not just in the classroom, but also, taking that outside into organizations, companies, businesses. Collaboration is so critical, and kind of sharing, again, because one, we talked about a little bit earlier, sharing that knowledge, because the way we look at one thing may be different from the other person, right? Those different perspectives. But again, adding to that, why is collaboration so critical? And I guess from a leadership development standpoint.
I think you nailed it on the head when you talked about perspectives.
Yeah.
So in teaching LDR 100 and 200 in the past, or these classroom experiences, I don't know, these students are going to be like, will you stop talking about perspective taking? Can you stop talking about perspectives? But it is really one of the best things to have a better product. So if you're all working towards a goal, how do you get a better goal? You learn from others around you. You talk to people that are different from you. You learn about what's important to those people that you surround yourself with. And that just continues to grow why this is an important movement, or why you want to do what you want to do. And collaboration is a great way to do that, because in the Leadership Institute, maybe we have a philosophy, but we are a couple people sitting in a room having conversations. We surround ourselves with each other. How are we having conversations with the Volunteer Center? How are we having conversations with the Center for Student Inclusion and Diversity? Because adding those perspectives are going to make a better product or program or service for students that allows them to learn and grow. Because I only know so much, and by admitting that, I know that there's so much more to learn, and I have so many people who have different lived experiences, perspectives, and they show up in a different way. And if I'm not asking them, then I'm not doing everything I can to not only serve students, but make myself a better person.
Yeah, I love that answer. It's such a perspective's really everything, right? If you can understand your perspective and how it influences those around you and the world, but also take the time and understand others and respect others' perspectives, I mean, you're ahead of the game.
Well, and I think with leadership in particular, it can be politicized, and it can be very like, well, I believe this. But if you don't understand what the other perspective is, how are you going to move it forward? Exactly, whether your goal is completely different. If I have this goal and you have this goal and they're on two different ends, are we forcing everyone to go that way, or are we trying to make concession? I'm not talking about things like human rights. I'm not talking about things that are dehumanizing folks. Those things, to me, there is a clear way to do things, right? And I can listen to you, but I don't necessarily have to agree or compromise on human rights. Like, I'm just not going to do that as an ethical leader, right? But I think when you're talking about collaboration, or you're talking about programming, or you're talking about even LDR 200, these theories are very limited perspectives. We've talked about that. So I always say, do you have another theory? Have you heard of something? How are you questioning these theories when we're having this conversation? Because what was cool in 1960, I can guarantee doesn't apply today. Some of those nuggets might, right? But the world's a different place, and how are we still doing the same things we were doing 60 years ago?
It'd be a fun assignment for like students to kind of create their own theory.
I would be very intrigued. The assessment piece would be weird, but it would be fun.
It would be really weird, but it'd be fun.
When you offer things like that, we just talked about it, that means that you're going to have to help me figure out how to do it.
Yeah, launching at 60%, right? For sure. No, I really like that point you just made, because I think sometimes too, and it's tough, I think, right now in this world especially, and again, not just talking about politics, but just really everything. It's very like this or that, right? You're very forced to agree on one side or the other, but there's so much gray area in the middle, right? And there's a lot of reasons probably for that, and we don't need to get into that on the show, but I think it is really interesting how people, I feel like at times, are so quick to even shut down their own opinion because they'd rather agree fully with a person they're around, where it's like you might agree on the same result, but maybe it's a different way of approaching it, right? Or getting there. Or you might agree on some things, but maybe not everything. And so, again, really bringing that authentic piece to the conversation, I think, is so important, especially in leadership. But at the same time, though, being able and open to taking that feedback, right? To making sure that you're creating the best experience for all of those on your team and that you're working with is so important.
Right. But as a leader, none of that works if you don't build the foundation, right? Like, I can't ask folks to walk into a space and be vulnerable with me on day one.
Right.
Like, if I'm not modeling that way, if I'm not having those conversations, if I'm not getting to know you as a whole person, you're not going to come to that space and you're going to be like, I don't agree with you. Why would you, right?
Exactly.
Because I've not created a space that's been conducive to feedback, right? So until you're willing to, as a leader, accept feedback and give feedback, kind of like what we're reading about in that book, you haven't done the work to make a better product, to have collaboration. It's give and take. If you're just taking, it's not going to work.
Exactly. Model the way. That's the same thing, right? Like, you can't ethically lead when only things are going well, right? And then not lead when things are bad. That's not leadership. So, and things like that. But anyways, moving forward here, super important points though just made. So how can leadership development programs, we talked about this already a little bit, but kind of enhance an individual's leadership skills, and then how can they take those into quote unquote maybe the real world or their career afterwards, because kind of talking about a little bit earlier as well, employers are looking for those leadership skills, right? Those they call them soft skills. I once heard someone refer to them as human skills, which I think is so much better. But things like, emotional intelligence, leadership, problem solving, critical thinking, which you really do get a lot of that development within leadership development, at least through the programs here at CMU. So again, how do those going to those programs really enhance those skills, and how are they applicable outside of college?
Right. I think you're probably getting those skills in the things you're already doing, right? It's all about this articulation piece, and that comes from the reflection of your experiences. So the National Association of Colleges and Employers comes out with a list of top 8 employer desired skills, right? And leadership is always near the top, and it's things like teamwork, critical thinking. I mean, there are technical skills. Like if you're going into engineering, you need to know how to probably code or do some engineering, but you also need to know how to lead a team, and you need to be able to have conversations across difference, right? So look at that list. It's as easy. Sometimes we try to make things harder than they are. I think we do. I do. I'm a human. I think that's what humans do sometimes. Yeah. But look at the list and ask yourself, when have I had to help build a team? How do you reflect on that? Come up with specific examples. How do you articulate that? And if you can't find one of those things, that's your gap. That's your area you need to focus on. And then you ask those people that are mentoring you, or you ask your friends like, hey, I'm really having a hard time thinking about how I've really fostered teamwork, or how I've learned how to lead across difference or have conversations across difference. How did you do that? Like, you've seemed to nail that. Ask the questions and then follow up and do the work yourself. But you won't know that until you reflect on what you already know, what you already feel like are your strengths, and then kind of filling in the gaps a bit.
Love that. So we've obviously touched upon a lot about reflection and how that's so good. I mean, it's one of the 3 pillars that new saying we're using. We're rolling it off. That's the highlight, big nugget of the episode. If you don't take anything else away, it's those three parts of leadership development that we've talked about so much. So we've talked a lot about reflection, though. How can students do that work? Like, is there any things that you've done that help, or any ideas or examples that you can share of how to reflect? Obviously, maybe some people might be journaling, but is there anything else that you can kind of do to do that inner self work outside of those experiences?
Yeah, I'm not much of a journaler. Okay. I think that works well for some people, but it's just, you got to try different methods and find out what works for you. What might work for you this week might not work next week. I mean, I'm not going to say it, but Google's a great friend. Just Google, I'm trying to reflect on something, or reflection questions. A lot of the programs on this campus, whether you're doing alternative breaks, or you're doing a program with student activities and involvement, multicultural academic student services, or the Leadership Institute, we have built-in reflections. We don't name it that. We're not we're going to sit down and reflect, right? It's when they say all right, so what did you learn, and what's going to be your next step, right? Because you're thinking of the past, what you did, and then you're talking about how it's going to change your behavior in the future. That's all reflection is. It doesn't need to be a huge process for you. You can ask yourself, what did I do well? What didn't I do well? I think just asking yourself a simple set of questions that you can describe what you did, you can evaluate what you did, you can assess what you did. But at the end of the day, it's as easy as saying, what did I do well? What do I need to grow on? What did this experience teach me? And what didn't I learn? And then fill it in where you need to.
Love that. Yeah, we just kind of talked about this a little bit, but I think it's so important. I'll go a little bit deeper here, but self-awareness. So really, how does that contribute to leadership development and also leading a team? It's kind of an open-ended, kind of broad question, but
that's a doozy. I like it. Yeah. I think, and this is just my perspective, right? Because I guarantee there are formal ways. There are always books to talk about self-awareness and emotional intelligence. And those are great resources because they allow you to have language, and it's always easier. You can think something, but when someone tells you it's true, sometimes it just hits different, right? So I think that's a great opportunity. But I think with self-awareness, it's just the ability to ask yourself the tough questions and be honest with yourself. It's easy to, I should do this, or I should be like this, but that's not what I actually do. So are you walking the walk in the same way you're talking the talk? So ask yourself, what are my values? If you haven't had the chance to do a values exercise, ask the Leadership Institute. We're doing them all the time, and we'd be happy to help you with what that looks like. And does this align with my values? Asking yourself simple sets of questions around How did I show up in this space? Asking your friends, asking your family. This is how I think I am. Is this kind of what you've seen too? And they'll be honest with you, especially if you're saying you're coming from a place where you're welcoming feedback and where you are excited to learn and grow. I also think it's really important that you can't lead others until you know yourself and who you are. I think it makes it way easier. One, you have more confidence, which I think comes through. Two, you better understand your own boundaries. You're more willing to delegate. You're more willing to understand and trust others when you know your own strengths and weaknesses and how you're aware of those things. But it all starts with a conversation and asking yourself some questions and from yourself and those around you that are important to you.
Look yourself in the mirror and walk the walk.
Well, you got to walk it.
Always, right? You always got to walk the walk, right?
True.
Model the way.
Yes.
Love that. So what are some ways to develop adaptability in leaders? So kind of going off the frame of this question, so maybe the audience, now they're trying to implement these great strategies and ideas into their teams or organizations. How can they kind of train or develop adaptability in someone or a group of people?
Yeah, I think building some action steps around what that looks like. I mean, we all just lived through a pandemic.
Right.
We all learned that sometimes you just got to pivot hard, right?
Yep.
And so I think this generation, and I'm not all about generations because I think that kind of like puts people in boxes, which we've talked about a lot and which I don't necessarily love. But this generation, y'all like grew up needing to pivot hard quickly, right? And so I think you now understand that the structures that we've put into place that seem rigid or that seem like inflexible, which is actually the same word, but you know what I mean? The things that we think have to be a certain way don't.
Right.
And so question what that looks like. If for some reason you're having a fundraiser and it's going really poorly and you decide like, okay, maybe we don't need to do karaoke, maybe we're going to do a dance. Sometimes you just got to call an audible.
Yep.
Launch at 60% and hope it works out, right?
Uh-huh.
So you just got to practice. You just got to do it. Yes, there's books you can read. Yes, there's entire theories around what that looks like if you want to look at it. Like I mentioned multiple times, one of my favorite ones is adaptive leadership. So how as a leader are you taking a step back? And it's this idea of this balcony, right? So you're looking out over the balcony at the situation and coming up with different ideas about how to solve that. You're not necessarily solving the problems, but you're offering potential solutions to your group so that they can choose what's best for them. Because when choosing for an entire group, you obviously, like we said, need to bring in those perspectives. Yeah. So adaptability is all a learned skill that you all already mastered and you've had to over the last couple of years. So just live in that space and trust yourself and understand that it might work sometimes and it might not in others, and lean on your mentors and have some fun.
Yeah. I think a great way to almost in that situation, if you do need to make a change or adapt, open the floor to your team too, right? Because they're seeing so many different things from different angles or different perspectives, and they might have a great idea. And I think it can be really difficult at times, too, especially when you've poured a lot of effort and time and energy into a project or a program and it doesn't hit or it's not going the way it should, to almost step back and be vulnerable because you probably have taken some risks, right? Maybe you've persuaded some people or have had some deep conversations about why we should do one thing, and then if it doesn't work, to really be vulnerable in that setting and then ask for help, right? Or ask for other ideas. That can be really challenging. Is there any advice for people that you have that are going through something like that to kind of share with? Or
yeah, Google different ways to build critical thinking. Put yourself in situations that are low risk where you have to adapt or think differently, like things that maybe are easy to think about is like in a class where you normally don't speak. If you don't 100% know the answer, sometimes that's a little scary to like put your hand up and throw it out there. But if there's not a clear cut yes or no to the question, like if I ask a question about like why is leadership important, you might think I want a certain answer, right? But put yourself out there, and I think you'll realize when you do that, people are willing to help. People are willing to learn and grow alongside you for the most part. And if they're not the people you want to learn leadership from anyways, right? And so I think being able to be vulnerable in those spaces. Again, I cannot reiterate enough that I struggle with vulnerability because it's safer for some people to be vulnerable in spaces than others, especially those with minoritized identities and folks that have different resources on the line. Like if I ask for $1,000 and our budget is $2,000 for a program and the program flops, that's 50% of our budget, right? Like there's a lot on the line, and I'll probably be more hesitant to be like, well, that was a flop. But if I'm really working towards the goal and we've really built the trust and have that foundation within this team or within this space, they're going to be like, okay, this isn't going well, but here's what we can do. So you really have to build that trust ahead of time in order to have those moments of vulnerability, in order to make it safe for others too as well.
I love that. It's so critical, so important. So kind of going off, you mentioned it a little bit ago about delegation and how that's such a big part of leadership, but it also can be some of the most challenging, right? How can a leader develop their ability to empower and delegate effectively and efficiently on their teams?
Yeah, I don't know if this is the best question for me because I'm not that great at it either. I think it's probably one of the most challenging things to do, especially when you're passionate about something. Think about it just like what you just mentioned. If you started an RSO and you've poured your soul into that registered student organization or into that cause, and then maybe you're trusting someone else to fill out the paperwork in order to get it re-registered, and you're like, if this doesn't go well, like everything I worked for is on the line. But you have to realize you're not always going to be in that space.
Right.
So at some point you have to be able to delegate. And is it better to delegate while you're still there to help or to pick up the pieces if things don't work? Or is it better to just throw them in the deep end on their own? So my thing is if I can delegate and build that trust, I think that's the way to go. Maybe you start, especially if you're like me and maybe you're kind of building up to delegation, is start with little things. Start with things that are maybe not as consequential as an entire RSO folding.
Right.
Start with like, hey, can you make the posters for this session, right? And you set a deadline a little earlier so that you have time to kind of either provide edits or recoup. But building that trust takes time, and it's and over time you kind of do those things. So I think you just need to be prepared to start small and then work up to what you need to do. But you have to be able to do it a little bit because no one can do everything.
Yeah. No, I really like that answer, and I think it is so important. And I love how you frame that as, and like, you gotta start small, and I think that is a really good way to do it. I know I've really struggled with delegation through my leadership development. It can be really difficult, again, especially when you have that passion for something. Maybe you're the creator, maybe you're not, but maybe you just really, spend a lot of time on something. What can someone do? Because I think this is common that can happen too. Is you delegate, right, and it doesn't go well.
Yeah, that one's tough.
Yeah, that one's tough, right? Yeah, is there anything?
Yeah, that one's tough. I think you just have to have an open conversation about what that looks like. I also think it's very important to have clear expectations. So if you're a leader within a space, yes, you co-construct those expectations. Like we've had times where I'm like, hey, we need to get X, Y, and Z done by, 3 weeks from now. What does your timeline look like? And if I don't know you as a person, you don't trust me to say, like, I have 5 papers due in the next 3 weeks. Like, my mental capacity is going to be full. I don't know if I should necessarily take this on. And you say, yeah, sure. And I'm like, well, what do you need? And you're like, I don't need anything. I'm going to trust you and go about my day. Yeah. And then in 3 weeks, when maybe something comes forward that isn't up to the standards that you're used to, we have a conversation about that. But if we've built that foundation, ideally, we can have a conversation, or you're stopping proactively and telling me like, hey, I'm at capacity, I'm gonna need some help with this project. But if you don't have that, and it's something little that's inconsequential, and it comes to you, just have a conversation like, hey, when we talked about this coming in this time. I know this isn't necessarily maybe the quality you want it to be. You want to talk about it?
Yeah.
Because I think there's something missed, and I don't know if this is from Ted Lasso. I don't know what this is from, but this idea of like being curious, not judgmental.
Yeah.
So it's easy for me to come down and be like, Brandon, why didn't you do this? Like you had one job kind of meme, you know what I'm saying? But if I lean in to say like, hey, I noticed this isn't up to the quality of work that we had normally done. Like, is something going on? Are you doing all right? And then if you share that space, if you're like, yeah, I just didn't want to do it, that's a different ball game. But most of the time, if you know someone, you're going to know that they're trying to do their best, right? So just kind of lean into curiosity, and then sometimes you're just going to have to pick up the slack and do it yourself.
For sure. Ooh, that is a tough one. I love that response too. It's just, you never know, right? But sometimes it also might be an opportunity for you to grow as a leader and be like, maybe I didn't explain that well enough,
Correct.
right? Maybe I didn't make my expectations clear, or in a way that person needed to, or created that space for that conversation to even happen, right? And I really like how you touched upon, I think you said co-constructed expectations, right? Creating those community standards, right, or guidelines, those kind of things. Because it is a joint effort, right? I don't think if you came from the top down in that leadership role and said, hey, X, Y, and Z, or it's how it's going to roll, you're not going to build a lot of credibility, and a lot of people aren't going to respect that naturally, right? And I think that might sometimes that people run into that problem a little bit. Maybe they don't have that full knowledge of leadership. They've been pushed into leadership roles without getting trained, or even sometimes naturally, you have pressure maybe from someone above you or another person to get something done. And then you kind of maybe default to that, right? Like, this is how it's going to go, by when. But in reality, you really need to make sure that everyone's kind of a part of that conversation that's going to be doing that work as a team. So.
And I think it's hard, right? Because a lot of the leadership things that I've learned about, I'll speak from my own perspective, that I've learned about growing up is like, they tell you what to do and you just do it, right?
Right, exactly.
But I think that it's invaluable to explain the why behind something, because if you can motivate someone beyond just the transactional nature of a task, right? Like if I say, I need you to do this in 3 weeks, and you're like, well, this doesn't seem that important. But if I say, I need you to do this in 3 weeks because then it's going to help me secure funding so we can do the programming we need, you're like, oh, okay, I get the bigger picture now. If I come up to you and like, you need to do this, you're going to be like, oh. There's no reason. But if I explain it to you, then I think there's a better opportunity for you to be onboarded, invested, and then maybe be more vulnerable and explain why, because you see the bigger picture. But I think as leaders, that takes time, and we're usually stretched thin. Looking at you all, you CMU students in 28 different involvements. You can be stretched in, and explaining the why takes time. But if you realize it might save you time in the long run, I think it's worth taking a beat if you care about people to do so. Yeah.
No, definitely. I think, too, even going off of that, the why we're doing something, I think that also helps, because if it doesn't relate to your overall purpose, right, or your team's mission, then why are you doing it anyways, right? You might have to do some things, but if you can't really explain it concisely and clearly of why we're doing this, maybe that's time to reassess as well. Like, maybe we shouldn't spend this time and resources on this certain task or project, because it might not even benefit what you're trying to do. So, again, having that clarity is always great, too, at the top, which I'm sure we'll talk about in different episodes and stuff and whatnot. But love that. So, what's one piece of advice you'd like to share with the audience? Anything like leadership related that you'd have for, again, maybe some students, other viewers out there that are really trying to just maybe make a change in the organization, right, or take in some of these leadership concepts and knowledge and share that with others?
I think if there's one thing you get out of today's podcast, other than reflect, grow, and learn, right, that, and ideally out of the entire podcast, is that anyone can be a leader. I think it's easy to say folks are leaders when they're in those positions, but no matter what you do, if you stand up, if you have a vision, if you're helping move forward those visions, you're leading in that space. So call yourself a leader. Manifest that right now. Like, I don't know if you're listening to this, but I'll pause for a second. You are a leader. Say, I am a leader.
Jump up and down, shout it out 3 times. Might be goofy, but hey, you'll believe it, right?
I am a leader. And now all you have to do is say, how can I become a better leader? And enroll in that program. Take that leadership position. Find a mentor. Those are the things that you have to do in order to do that. But at the end of the day, you're a leader. So remember that and show up and show out to be that leader that we know you can be.
I love that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
What great advice. You are a leader. 100%.
100%.
Everyone's on their different journey too, right?
Correct.
So
it doesn't matter. And I think we think it has to be like formal. You can be a leader at work. You can be a leader in your family. You can be a leader to your siblings. You could be a leader to a volunteer organization. Don't think leadership has to look one way. It can be a number of different ways.
100%.
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, again, too, find the small things, right? I think some of the best leaders are the ones that notice those small details or the small important things that, again, make everyone's experience better. That relationship building component is so critical, and oftentimes can be overlooked, And I think we know that sometimes as people that, hey, we need to, make sure our team is ready to go in the right mindset, so many more things. But yeah, sometimes I think we still overlook it, or it's overshadowed by we got to get this result or this project that has to deliver. And sometimes that can be sacrificed. So even, again, if you're maybe someone who's looking to just make a difference in your organization or team, take on that role. Maybe give yourself a fake title, like, I don't know, I've heard Chief Heart Officer before. Yeah. Some organizations have that now, which is super awesome, I think. But even, like, again, maybe you're really focused on, again, making the workplace better for others in small ways. And that could really make a difference. And I think people will really appreciate that.
I also think people think leadership is like a goal or a product, but leadership is a relationship between you and a group that you're working alongside of. So your top mission is actually creating a relationship with those folks.
It's a process.
Yes. Your RSO might be to put on this fundraiser, and that's the product, right? But how do you get there? You get there by leading a team. So your primary focus is on them, not on the fundraiser, right? Mm-hmm. So I think when we shift our perspective around what is leadership, it's people. So learning how to be self-aware, people as in yourself and people that you're on a team with, learning yourself and learning them is one of the top things you can do in order to move forward with whatever goal you have.
Yeah, love that. Thank you. Any quick questions for me, for the audience? I mean, we got a couple more things here, but.
Yeah, no, I think especially for the audience, if we're going to talk about reflection, we should open up space. So ask yourself, when was the last time you thought of yourself as a leader? And if you can't think of that, ask a friend, have you ever seen me lead anywhere? And so take a second after this podcast, during this podcast, pause it and ask yourself, what's my next action step? What am I going to do? Whether it's listen to the next episode of the podcast, stop in the Leadership Institute, find a mentor, but ask yourself, what is my nugget from this podcast and what am I going to do about it?
What is my nugget? Maybe you want like a 4-piece nugget too, you know, really take away. Hopefully, you know, you're getting more than one nugget out. But if you're only getting one too, that's wonderful. And that's amazing. So, no, I really, really like that. So thanks for opening up that reflection.
Of course.
Kind of piece there for our students to really take a look at themselves and what they've learned so far throughout the show. So before we wrap this up, actually, we got our quick session with our CTO, our Chief Technology Officer. It's Mello time. Mello, he's gonna come out here and he's gonna do a little fun wrap up here, real quick.
Oh, nice.
So, in our previous episode, Allie asked, what is one of your biggest leadership learning moments?
Of course, Allie would ask that question. I love her. I think I hit on this a little bit earlier. That's a really good question. Personally, for me, it was when I stopped trying to be somebody I wasn't. I think it's easy. Like, I love other people's leadership styles. The people who can get up in front of a crowd, like, with no preparation and, like, bust out the world's most motivational speech of all time. Yeah. I was like, in order to be a leader, I need to do those things. But once I embraced my own style and once I was like, I will never be that person. I have not had the same experiences. I do not have the same strengths. I do not have the same areas. I realized that my leadership is just as important as their leadership. And it really takes all of us in order to make the team work. So I was really thankful for the opportunity to reflect and say, I don't need to be who I'm not. I need to grow and learn. I need to evolve. But I don't need to be who I'm not.
I would probably say I agree with you, and I appreciate that response, because I would see myself as a leader sometimes growing up, but I used to think that being a leader meant like, oh, you have to be this dominant, forceful type of person. And that's just not the type of person who I am. Right. I'm more of the influential type of, like, this is how you do it, and the person who is learning from me is like, oh, thank you so much for, like, actually showing me instead of, like, forcing me, So I agree with you on that one. It's definitely a lot of different leadership styles to, adapt, or I would say to present.
Yeah. To achieve your goal. You need all of them. That's why there's not just one leadership style or approach. That's not why you're born with it. It's how you learn and grow and make it your own. So, and I would argue you've been a leader since the day I saw you. So
thank you.
You're already leading on this campus.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. Well, I'll see you later.
All right. Thanks for swinging in.
Thanks, Mello. That was our show producer. Awesome dude. Definitely connect with him if you're around town. So we'll pass it on to you now. You have the opportunity to ask our next guest a question related to leadership, which you don't know who it is, which makes it fun. It's kind of a surprise. So what do you got for them?
If you had to name one leadership quality that you think is most important, what would it be and why?
Ooh, okay. That's a good one. I'm excited to see who answers that, what they answer. You have to tune in next episode to find that out. Jenny, again, thank you so much for being here. Real quick, where can people find you?
Yeah, my office is located in Powers Hall, room 131. But as I hope you know by now, the Leadership Institute has offices anywhere. So feel free to stop by the University Center. Any of them know how to get a hold of me. You can swing by the Powers 100 location. If you see Dan, you see Brandon, you see Mello, just say, hey, where's Jenny? And they'll find me for you.
Yeah. I mean, any resources that come into the top of your head, we can also link them in the description down below. That would be great, kind of related to what we talked about today or anything. Or if, again, they're not right here right now, we can definitely compile a list together. But any that pop to your mind?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea to check out the resources available at CMU. So looking into leadership learning here, checking with the Leadership Institute. There's a ton of books. Some are hits and some are misses. You just kind of find out what works for you. But yeah, I'll drop a couple in the comments once this drops, and we'll kind of see where it goes from there.
I love that. We need like a Dr. Dre book list. You know?
I don't know if we need a Dr. Dre book list. I think we've talked about different perspectives, and I have a limited one. So maybe we need like a shared book list. So in the comments, if one of y'all have a book recommendation about leadership, you should drop it too, because I'd love to read the ones that you suggest as well.
Always a step ahead. I love that. For sure, yes. Definitely drop your favorite book or any other resources you might have. And as well, too, if you can, if you're still watching, definitely leave a comment of one thing, your nugget, your takeaway. Because, again, what you learn can help others when they read your comments as well. So, yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah,
thanks for being
having
here.
me.
It was super awesome. Yeah, so that's all we have for you today. We'll be right here, same time next week with our next episode of Lean Into Leadership, where, again, you get to see the special guest answer Dr. Drevon's question. But, yeah, it was great, chatting and learning with you today and with y'all, and, keep leading the way.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Have a great day.
Peace.